Boston's surge in housing was supposed to relieve market pressure, but a new report's raising questions about the contribution of luxury housing. The report was done by the Institute for Policy Studies. To tell us about the findings and recommendations is the author of the report, Chuck Collins. Thank you very much for being with us, Chuck.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Chuck, you're talking about the tallest buildings in town, the priciest buildings in town, and why should we care who owns the units?
Well, we should care for a couple reasons. One is we want to know who's buying Boston. I think the myth or the story is that these are people from the suburbs who are emptying their nests and they're coming in to live in the city. But what we're seeing is a huge amount of global investors, global wealthy, and shell corporations. And in those cases, we actually don't know who is buying the units, and that puts us at risk of the Boston luxury real estate market being used for money laundering and illicit money flows.
Now, of course, there are some other incentives going on here as well, including that you can get visas, right?
Right. So one of the things that some of the developers, luxury developers, are doing is they're using what's called the EB-5 visa program, which is they actually allow investors to buy a green card. So for $500,000 or $1 million investment, depending on the neighborhood, you can get a 2-year green card and a pathway to citizenship. So that's another one of the ironies here is as people are being displaced or being separated from their children, low-income people, low-income immigrants, wealthy immigrants are buying their citizenship in Boston.
Now, of course, one of the things I guessed maybe from the get-go about these buildings is that the units would be bought by, well, probably absentee speculators. What's wrong with that?
Well, again, I think what makes for a neighborhood is people who live in a neighborhood and have a stake in that. And we know that whether it's Mattapan or Jamaica Plain where I live, or, you want to have the people who own property have a stake there. And what the problem is that people are treating these are not homes. These are wealth storage units. These are investments for global multimillionaires and billionaires. In fact, there's one article, it's actually on the One Dalton Place website. It says, who needs neighborhoods with amenities like this?
And of course, for people who don't know about One Dalton, because we don't live there yet, it's still under construction and it's pretty close to the Prudential, right?
That's right. If you look at the Prudential Center, you'll see this tower rising next to it. It's going to be Boston's tallest residential luxury tower, 61 units. The penthouse is going to go for $40 million, which is 700 times the median income of the average Bostonian. So part of the point here is this is not housing for Bostonians. Okay, maybe that doesn't matter. But I think the question is this helping the affordable housing crisis or worsening it? Is it putting other risks on the citizens of Boston, or is it is it going to worsen inequality and the racial wealth divide or make it better? And our report is saying we should be paying attention to some of these dangers.
Now, one question I was asking myself when I read this report was that should the city be promoting housing production of a different kind? And I say promoting doesn't mean necessarily subsidizing, but if we had different kinds of buildings for different kinds of buyers, would that make things better?
Well, I think we want to have all kinds of housing for all kinds of people. And in fairness to the city, I think the city obviously really cares about affordable housing, cares about inequality, sees the luxury housing as bringing in tax revenue, creating good jobs, and they're negotiating with developers for linkage funds that could be dedicated to affordable housing. So that's the plus side. My question is it enough? Meaning maybe the city should be doing more to protect Bostonians from this type of development. We should be taxing real estate transactions at a higher level so we capture some of that global wealth as it passes through Boston. Maybe we should tax vacancies to discourage units sitting empty. And we should probably require these buildings to be green buildings. If you're going to put billions of dollars into building a building, at least make sure it doesn't require new fossil fuel infrastructure, which unfortunately is not the case with a lot of these luxury buildings.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Chuck Collins from the Institute for Policy Studies. Chuck, you spent a lot of time poring over the ownership of these buildings, and I guess there's something that struck you as strange about a lot of them. What was that exactly?
Well, we actually looked at 12 luxury buildings that are currently occupied. And Chris, as you know, there's thousands of more units in the development pipeline, that will be coming up in the next couple of years. But we just looked at the ones where we where there are already people in them, 2/3 of those units, the residents don't take the residential property tax exemption, meaning that they're not intending that to be their primary residence. 1/3 of them are owned by shell corporations or trusts that mask who the owners are. And in some buildings, the number of absentee owners is as high as 80%. The number of shell corporations is 50, 60%. So there's some buildings where they're almost entirely wealth storage units for foreign investors.
Now, there are a lot of developers who set up LLCs in Dorchester, East Boston, Jamaica Plain, and that seems to be pretty ordinary. What gives you the hint that there's something else going on with these?
Well, it's understandable if somebody creates an LLC to limit liability. I mean, that's the purpose of it. But if they're incorporating in Delaware or Wyoming or using kind of one of these states that don't require you to disclose ownership, then it's really about hiding who the owner is. So I don't have a problem with somebody saying, oh, we want to limit liability. It's when it becomes a secretive enterprise. I think Boston should have the public library card test, which is if you and I go to the Boston Public Library, we have to prove who we are and where we live. We even have to bring in a piece of mail that shows a utility bill that we actually live at our address. These property owners have less of a requirement than the public library does to get a library card. And I think you should have the same level of disclosure in real estate ownership as you do to get a library card in Boston.
Of course, one other possibility about the opacity around the ownership here is that you have empty nesters with a lot of money, and they're trying to protect their assets. So, what's wrong with that? Could that be what's going on here in a lot of these units too?
Well, I think that's fair. I mean, this is a form of investment. You could buy artwork, you can be in the stock market, or you can buy Boston real estate. But at a certain point, if we have tens of thousands of mostly investment storage, wealth storage units, I think that puts the city at risk. It's going to compound inequality. It's going to create more vacant horizontal or vertical gated communities. It's going to, I think, put us at risk if there's an economic market downturn. I mean, one question is, it all looks beautiful today, but when we hit, 10 years ago, we had an economic meltdown. During the next economic meltdown, who's going to be holding the bag long after the investors leave?
Is there any way to tell that the units are vacant, at least in significant numbers? I mean, if they were, I would expect foreclosures or something like that. I mean, is there any way that you can tell?
There's no real way to tell. So some of those units are owned by absentee owner investors and they're renting them out. Some of them are just keeping them empty. Some of them maybe visit them a couple weeks a year. Who knows? We don't really know. There is a way other cities have dealt with this, which is they require owners to certify that the unit is occupied for more than 6 months of the year. So Vancouver has an empty homes tax, and every owner has to certify that their property is not going to be empty, or they pay a fee. And if they lie about that, then the penalties are extremely high. So you could put the burden on property owners to simply say it's vacant or not.
I'm sure a lot of our viewers would say that the people who own these units could pay a bit more in taxes, but how far can you go with that before you discourage new production?
I think that's a good question. I don't think we're there. I think that there's a significant boom. Right now, there is an affordable housing set aside, or funds are linked to our affordable housing program. I think a 13% set aside. I think in this market, we probably could go higher. We could certainly have a real estate transfer tax, which isn't going to discourage development. It just sort of says when a property changes hands, a portion of that is taxed. I think it's a fine balancing act. I would say at this point, the burden is on the city, who is approving, thousands of units of luxury housing. The burden is on the city to show us that this is having a net positive benefit for Bostonians, for low and middle income Bostonians.
When we see these buildings, I think we assume they're a nice investment for the same reason as a house in Dorchester or Jamaica Plain could be a nice investment. But if you look at what's really making these buildings so magnetic for investments, aren't we talking about other factors that maybe have you more worried? What kind of factors do you think account for this?
account for.
Yeah, why people invest so much in these buildings.
Yeah.
I mean, what's going on?
Well, part of what's happening is there's this global updraft of wealth. I mean, there's a huge, in the United States, but also globally, there's an extraordinary concentration of wealth at the very, very, very top. And so people are pushing out and saying, where do I park this money? I don't want to have it in the stock market. I can't have it all in equities. I want some of it to touch down in real property. So that's part of the demand. And then I think in the case of Boston, well, we're a great city and we have all these amenities and we have culture and life and arts, and we're a tolerant city. We're not a xenophobic city. We do welcome people from around the world. I think that's an attraction. My point is, in exchange for providing a safe haven for global capital, we should charge a little more.
And by the way, finally, we should mention if people want to see the report in full, you've got a place online where they can do that?
They could go to inequality.org and see the report right there along with some of the commentaries.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for having me.
Chuck Collins. In a moment, Suicide Prevention Month and a reminder about where to get help.